Our next speaker is Dr. Harry Rice, who is the Vice President of Regulatory and Scientific Affairs for GOED, as most of you know. Among his responsibilities for GOED are monitoring and reporting on regulatory issues, providing scientific analysis of the growing body of scientific literature. Dr. Rice earned his Master's and PhD in Nutrition from Penn State and his Bachelor of Science in Dietetics from Miami University at Ohio. Dr. Rice.
Well, hello everybody. Welcome. It's a pleasure for me to be up here today speaking to you. Thank you for the introduction, Will. I'm going to give you a very brief overview on the state of the science related to heart health, cardiovascular health. I want to start by being very clear, and quite frankly, if you tune out the rest of my presentation, I want to be very clear, and I would hope you would remember this, that studies conducted in diseased populations cannot be generalized to a normal, healthy population. So I'm not going to ask you to repeat that by any means, but I want you to keep that in mind because we've seen a lot of studies in recent times that are conducted in diseased populations, and the generalization is that it applies to everybody, even those that don't have cardiovascular disease. So here, up on the screen, I've pointed out the different types of prevention. And primary prevention is prevention of disease in a normal, healthy population. So you are trying to prevent the disease from ever occurring. Secondary prevention is detecting and treating the disease before it's symptomatic. Now here's the interesting thing. Tertiary prevention is the prevention of symptomatic disease progression. So I would contend, and I don't know that it really matters for the purposes of my presentation here, or actually for the purposes of really understanding the scientific literature related to cardiovascular health and omega-3s, but I would contend that a lot of the studies that are being reported as secondary prevention are actually tertiary prevention. But like I said, the important thing is that you be able to differentiate primary from secondary and tertiary. So in recent years, we've seen a sort of turn of events, if you will. Gone are the days where every study that came out was positive and it was great for the omega-3 market. We're now seeing studies that are being reported as negative. Well, let's clarify here. Negative is not negative. Negative is neutral. So no effect, lack of an effect. So why is this happening? It's important to keep these, if we're going to go, thank you, different issues or factors in mind, if you will. The first one I've pointed out here is the maintenance on aggressive cardiovascular drug treatment. There are many people that believe that this is the primary reason why a lot of these secondary prevention studies are coming back as, I'm going to call them neutral because they are neutral, but the media, popular press is calling them negative. So if you have, or if you're being maintained on an aggressive therapy of drugs, half a dozen different drugs, adding another one to the regime, it's very difficult to actually see an effect. And I would contend that if you added another cardiovascular developed drug to this regime, that you would have a very difficult time showing an effect. It's also the point of expanded endpoints. Typically, older studies dealt with mortality only, so now we're seeing additional endpoints being added. The next one, higher background omega-3 intake. While omega-3 intake is still low, pretty much globally, there are countries where we're seeing what we would call a sufficient intake of omega-3s. Most places, it's still lower than we believe it should be. Well, it's maybe lower than we think it should be, want it to be, but the reality is that we're seeing an increase. And any number of reasons could account for this. It could be that awareness is increasing. But with a higher background omega-3 intake with these subjects, it's much more difficult to see an effect. Too few subjects. This gets at power. And so if you have too few subjects in a study, it's not really a lack of an effect. It's a failure to detect an effect, if you will. So it's very, very important to keep in mind. Treatment duration could be too short. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Omega-3 assessment method. You can assess, you can look at plasma, you can look at red blood cells, you could do muscle biopsies. You could assess omega-3 intake based on food frequency questionnaires, a 24-hour intake, any number of days. So there are many different assessment methods. Everybody seems to be critical of everyone out there. Some are better received than others. I myself have an opinion, but I'm not going to share that right now. Genetics. Genetics is a huge one. Genetics, along with sex, meaning male and female. Seeing a lot of studies that are being published where there are sex differences or there's a genetic variation which is resulting in a difference in an effect of the omega-3s. I'm not going to get into this. I am not an expert on this by any means. Dr. Ski-Chilton is here. I don't know how much he'll get into any of this when he speaks, I believe, tomorrow. But he's the one that you want to seek out and talk to about this. He has fascinating stories on his research. He's a wealth of information. Inappropriate placebo. So this is a controversial one of sorts. When we see these studies that come out, neutral studies, people will go through and they'll, I'll say, they tear them apart. They look for the things that are bad. Well, one of the things is, oh, this was a terrible placebo. Well, the question is, what's a good placebo? Well, people aren't really willing to stand up and say X, Y, or Z is a good placebo, but they are willing to say what's not a good placebo. Olive oil is considered not to be a good placebo. There are health benefits to the oleic acid in olive oil. I'm not certain that it's a bad placebo. Finally, the omega-3 dosage is too low. This has been a big criticism of many recent studies. Again, whether or not this is true or not, it's speculation until it's proven. So what I've done here is I've listed more than a handful of studies that have been neutral in recent years. I'm not going to go through them. There are a couple of papers that I referenced at the bottom. By no means can you see that reference, not meant for you to be able to see, but when you look at my slides, you'll be able to see those references. Two papers, one by Dr. Harris, the other by two authors, Dr. Wu and Dr. Mozafarian. And that paper just came out last week, I believe. Both very good papers. They talk about many of these studies that I've listed here. I would urge you to go visit those papers. I think they're easy to read. They're not scientific, in-depth scientific reviews. I think they're very well written and they speak to the issues that we're seeing. Brings me to a GOED-sponsored workshop that we're having at the upcoming ISFAL Congress in 2014. This takes place every 2 years. This coming Congress will be June 28th to July 2nd in Stockholm, Sweden. We're sponsoring a workshop on conducting omega-3 clinical trials. We're really looking forward to this. We really don't have the details hammered out yet, but really what we want to do, more or less, is have people come in, present on what they believe are the appropriate things to consider in an experimental design, so that if somebody is going to conduct an omega-3 clinical trial and they don't have a lot of experience in this area, they'll have something to reference. And so that reference, we hope, will be a journal article or proceedings from this workshop. I'm going to present 5 papers, and I want to be clear. These papers that I'm going to present do not provide a hardcore evidence for the benefits of omega-3s. They're suggestive. They provide correlations, okay? So I guess there would be one more thing that I'd want you to take away from this. A correlation does not provide causality. It does not equal causality. So this is, the first paper talks about cardiovascular disease mortality risk in Japanese. This was a prospective cohort study, greater than 9,000 people. At baseline, they were free from cardiovascular disease. They were followed for 24 years. The finding, cardiovascular disease mortality was lower and the highest, and this would be versus the lowest, quartile of long-chain omega-3 intake. And the mode of omega-3 assessment here was food intake records. So I knew that once I finished, somebody would ask me that, so I put that in. The second paper I want to talk to you about briefly is that, and I've put the tagline up there, omega-3s may add years to your life. Because basically that was the finding there. This was a prospective cohort study, 2,700 subjects in 4 US communities. Finding here is that higher circulating individual and total omega-3 PUFA levels were associated with lower total mortality. This was especially true for coronary heart disease. And this study, I didn't mention, was in older adults. So individuals in the highest quintile lived an average of 2.22 more years after the age of 65. I'm not certain about you, but if I could do something to increase my life expectancy, an average of 2 years, I'd do it. Definitely would. In this next one, the bullet I have here, the findings support an average target dietary range of 250 to 400 milligrams of EPA and DHA per day. I put this one in here because I found this to be very interesting. This paper, the first author on it is Dr. Dariush Mozaffarian, and he has said many times, he's gone on record saying that up to 250 milligrams, you see increasing benefits, but over 250, really the benefits diminish. And so this was really the first time since I've been reading all those accounts where he's gone on record suggesting that more than 250 milligrams a day would be beneficial. The next paper would be an update, a 2014 update, Heart Disease and Stroke. This was a meta-analysis of 16 prospective cohort studies, included over 300,000 healthy individuals globally, so in Europe, the US, China, and Japan. Here, fish consumption was associated with significantly lower risk of coronary heart disease mortality. So compared with no consumption, an estimated 250 milligrams of EPA and DHA per day was associated with a 35% lower risk of coronary heart disease. Again, something as easy as increasing fish intake to increase your levels of EPA and DHA, or taking EPA and DHA-rich supplements to achieve this benefit, seems like a no-brainer to me. And finally, I want to talk about, actually, I'm sorry, this may be the second to last one. Diabetes and cardiovascular disease are very much correlated. And we had a science committee meeting this morning, and we talked about diabetes and the risk of that progressing into cardiovascular disease, which is why this was included in this presentation. So, prospective cohort study of greater than 2,000 middle-aged men. These men were Finnish. The average follow-up was 19.3 years, which is pretty impressive. In that time, 422 men developed type 2 diabetes. But here's the amazing thing. The men in the highest quartile of omega-3 intake had 33% lower risk for type 2 diabetes. So again, I mean, we have here a correlation. Again, not a cause and effect. It's a correlation, but really pointing in the direction of a benefit. Global burden of disease. I'm going to really stumble through this slide, so I'm going to apologize. But I need to present to you what a DALY is. It's a disability-adjusted life year. And it's a measure of the overall disease burden expressed as the number of years lost due to ill health, disability or early death, pardon me. And so in 2010, when the data was collected here, the attributable burden of a diet low in seafood omega-3s, EPA and DHA, was 1.1% of the global disability-adjusted life years. I think that's pretty staggering. I mean, 1.1% doesn't sound like a lot, but if you're talking about, if you're talking about something as immense as disability in those that are disabled or losing their health or succumbing to mortality, if you will. 22% of ischemic heart disease disability-adjusted life years were attributed to low seafood omega-3 intake. And finally, diets low in EPA and DHA accounted for over 1 million deaths in 1990. And in 2010, over 1 million deaths. But we're talking an increase of over 300,000 deaths from 1990 to 2010, a span of 20 years. Now, I couldn't even begin to tell you how this data is calculated or analyzed. I'll put Dr. Berlusconi on the firing line here if anybody wants to ask him, because I think he has a much better idea. But again, I think these numbers speak for themselves. Low omega-3 intake is associated with deaths. There's no doubt. We see this time and time again. We keep seeing these kinds of analyses. Finally, I just want to talk about government-associated intake recommendations and health claims. So they exist. There aren't as many as we'd like to see, but intake recommendations around the world, we see Australia, New Zealand, European Union, France and Belgium, and this would be in addition to the European Union recommendation, and Japan. As far as health claims are concerned, seeing in Australia, New Zealand, Korea, Chile, Brazil, the European Union, Canada for natural health products, and the United States has really failed to really come up with anything or to support anything, if you will. We have a qualified health claim, 2004. The FDA, in its infinite wisdom, not to criticize them because I think that they can do a pretty good job, but they did not believe that the scientific evidence in support of a health claim reached significant scientific agreement. So, for the last decade, we've seen a qualified health claim. Supportive but not conclusive research shows that consumption of EPA and DHA, omega-3 fatty acids, may reduce the risk of coronary heart disease. Well, 2004, the qualified health claim, I'll say, came out, was approved. So the literature review for that health claim, I think the cutoff on that was 2002, maybe early 2003. There's been an explosion in the amount of high-quality scientific evidence in support of the cardiovascular benefits for omega-3. This is good news. So, in response, GOED has submitted a health claim petition for an authorized health claim. It's associated with blood pressure. The FDA considers blood pressure to be a surrogate biomarker for coronary heart disease. And the basis for this health claim petition is a meta-analysis of 70 randomized clinical trials which demonstrate a benefit of EPA and DHA. Here are the references. I know you can't read them, but I just want you to know that they're there, so if you want to find the papers, you're not scrambling around looking for them and cursing me under your breath. And finally, since you have been patient, is there any way to get the volume up on that? So, making light of the belief or the
crazy woman gaining!
Our omega-3 slick will take him down. Private, activate.
For those that believe that omega-3s are be-all to end-all and can be used for everything, this is for you. I think they're very important in our diet. I think they will improve our quality of life. I think they will extend our life. I suppose it could work. One of my favorite clips. So thank you for bearing with me on that one.